Is this just a little bit of shyness, or is this the child is secretly suffering?
How does anxiety actually impact a student's ability to learn and show what they know?
Anxiety literally hijacks the brain.
How anxiety actually feels in the body for our students?
That's a great question because anxiety is a spectrum. Don't relate to your kid's anxiety by talking about what you did in school 20 years ago. That's probably the biggest myth that we need to bust because most people think that anxiety is something that is observable.
I remember feeling a lot of anxiety at my old school. I had one specific teacher, my English teacher, and he quit during spring break. And before he quit, he told us how frustrated he was with us, so that made us just feel like it was our fault. It made me just kind of fall into this hole because I felt like I just can't do school.
Maddie felt very threatened to go to school and had a lot of anxiety related to deadlines and classes. And at one point, she was wandering around the school campus and not even attending classes. Anxiety became overwhelming and difficult to deal with. And a lot of times she wouldn't get out of bed and just didn't want to go.
One thing that I really remember too is hearing all the pencils going really fast around me and just standing there looking at my paper and looking around at everyone else and thinking, how are they doing this? And just anxiety totally filling up and I just didn't understand why I couldn't do what they were doing.
I realized when I look back, a lot of the issues were her anxiety and not really understanding and comprehending the academic demands. And so the anxiety would hit her when she had things due and she'd have to go back to school and she knew that she didn't understand it and she didn't do it.
At my old school, I just really felt like I had no potential. One of the biggest things that I loved was music and writing, and I just dropped that completely.
She became really rigid and negative in the prior school settings, which made it hard for us and hard for her to deal with emotionally. And that's when I realized, oh my God, she really does need one-to-one education.
School shouldn't feel like a threat, but for many students it does. Whether it's the fear of tests, sensory overload, or the pressure to fit in, anxiety can hijack a student's ability to learn, connect, and even to show up. Anxiety is now one of the most urgent challenges facing students today, from the rise of phone-based childhoods to school environments that don't feel safe or supportive. The message is clear. Kids are struggling, and they need us to respond. On this episode of Learning Differently, we talk with clinical psychologist Dr. Marta Shinn about what school anxiety really looks like, how it shows up differently across students, and what truly helps them feel safe, regulated, and ready to learn. Whether you are a parent, an educator, or a clinician, you'll leave with deeper insight and practical strategies that you can use right away. Dr. Shinn, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So books like The Anxious Generation and Disengaged Teen are really buzzing in the ed world right now. And I think they make one thing very heartbreakingly clear, and that's that we are in a mental health crisis and our kids are feeling the impact in very real and visible ways, right? So their stress, their shutdowns, their resistance to school, it is all telling us something. When we talk about a student having school anxiety, what do we mean by that?
We're talking about anxiety that relates to going to school, heading out the door, being at school, staying there, and being successful at school, and anxiety being a barrier to that success. But it can look lots of different ways for different students, depending on the root cause or what makes them feel anxious about school.
So could you talk a little bit more about what are the root causes? Because I'm imagining school anxiety encapsulates so many different flavors of anxiety.
Right. That's a big umbrella to literally mean what the expression says, anxiety that's happening about school or at school, right? And so that's broadly what it means. What some of the root causes are can stem from things like literally separation anxiety in very young children, the fear of going to someplace new in the beginning of our immersion into school as learners, right? The transition to a brand new school can provoke that sort of anxiety. So that's something that can happen. Other times it's anxiety about what students anticipate will occur at school, the academic demands, whether it's all of the academic demands or specific subjects that are challenging for them, whether it's having to interact with peers and feeling a sense of ineffectiveness about their ability to do that well, whether it's about avoidance of certain demands, fear of things related to educators and educator feedback toward them. So there are a variety of reasons that can cause a student to feel anxious about approaching a learning environment. So those are some of the things we want to think about. The other is that sometimes anxiety is not the primary issue. Anxiety could be the secondary issue. So case in point, you take students that have other primary conditions that co-occur or tend to produce anxiety, like ADHD, like speech and language disorders, like mood disorders, like not just anxiety, right? Learning disabilities. So thinking about that, I'm going to have to go to school and perform in these ways, like having autism and knowing that I have to be socially effective in this environment. So anticipating those things, the impact of your primary disability on your learning and contemplating that ahead of time can produce lots of anxiety. And then we have other things that are maybe not related to primary conditions or anxiety itself, but could be that there really is a particular danger at school, such as someone who persistently teases or bullies that student, and that can really provoke anxiety about being in the educational space.
So you're essentially saying all the things wrapped up into one, or a combination of different ones.
Yeah, I mean, it is so multi-layered, right, for students. And so I can imagine that many of these differences, these challenges can mask themselves. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they can be masked as, especially in the classroom?
Yeah, I think that the biggest sort of indicator of anxiety is the thing that educators love the most. What do educators love the most? Quiet students that listen, that are non-disruptive. And so that is an educator's preferred student because they can do their job when students are well-regulated or present as well-regulated in a learning environment, right? The challenge is that anxiety is often internalizing, and there are very few external symptoms that are visible to educators. And so the biggest clue that you might have an anxious student is you're hardly hearing from them. They present as shy, they present as guarded, they're apprehensive about participation. There's a reason for that. And that takes a little bit of uncovering and really noticing by the teacher, by the educators in the space to recognize, well, is this just a little bit of shyness, or is this the child is secretly suffering? And so that secret suffering is something that is really hard to pick up, but educators that are intentional about having a strong rapport with their students can really tune into that, in the same way that parents who are very familiar notice really slight variations in their child's mood, and they can kind of pick up like, okay, my kid's tired. They know what these nonverbal signs mean. Educators similarly can develop that with their students.
Yeah. It's so important that you're tuning into all of those, you're talking about and tuning into all those small nuances, because as you know, Dr. Shinn, we are very passionate about personalized education, right? And we understand all of the challenges that can come up in a traditional classroom where, maybe as a teacher, maybe you don't necessarily prefer the quiet student. But when you have a classroom of 30 to 40 kids, it's like tuning into everyone's individual needs can be really, really challenging. So then the default is the quiet kid. That's easier to manage from a behavior standpoint.
Right, exactly. So when you have smaller instructional environments, you really are able to offer more of that individualized attention and ability to tune in so that you can pick up on those nuances that you described. The more students you have, it's kind of like being in an auditorium. It's really hard to make connection if you're in an auditorium space. So decreasing the number of individuals or learners in an environment makes it easier for the educator to tune into differences, to learn behavioral patterns, and to notice if something's particularly different about the student.
Yeah, it's an absolute game changer for them.
I think what we're laying out is that the inability to feel comfortable or safe within the learning environment also affects academic performance, correct?
Yes.
But I'm wondering how you might also have seen it show up in the process of students being able to turn in work and perform on assessments. Like, do you see students perseverating over homework? Do you see, over preparation for tests, things like that? Because in some parts, anxiety could be helpful, right? Because it's nature's defense to say, hey, listen, we want to be able to be successful in this future situation.
Anxiety is good as long as it maintains our alertness to tasks, right? So if it helps us be engaged with the task and alert, then it's a good thing. But there is a tipping point where if you have too much anxiety, then it becomes debilitating. And I think that that's what you're describing. And that debilitation can look like a tendency toward perfectionism, a tendency toward, I just have to redo it, a tendency to avoid it altogether and say, oh my gosh, that's too distressing for me to do that academic task, so I'm just going to postpone. I'll do it tomorrow. And then that has the paradoxical effect of it amplifies anxiety instead of decreasing it. So absolutely, that impacts students' ability to perform in an educational setting, because the anxiety can really get in the way of them being able to get started with an academic task, pacing themselves effectively on that academic task, and then completing it and turning it in a way that's not just timely, but really reflects their work and not what you described, perseveration or overthinking about their performance. And performance anxiety is sort of its own subset of anxiety, right? Because that comes with the idea that this performance is going to be negatively judged.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to perform because I worry about criticism, or worse, my true deep fear is ridicule, that I'm going to do something so ridiculous that I'm going to completely embarrass myself. And that fear can be very paralyzing.
I think it's really important to note something that you said, which is that anxiety doesn't always show up the same way, right? It doesn't always show up as worry. Some things that it can look like are avoidance and perfectionism, withdrawal. Sometimes I've even seen in the classroom anger show up for students. And I think it's the reason why so many students with anxiety are misunderstood, right? It's like what looks like avoidance might actually be anxiety, even, in a way, like trying to protect them, I guess you could say. Yeah.
And you mentioned anger. Anger is a really, really great protective sort of emotion, because it's a way of saying, stand back, right? If I'm angry, I'm communicating to others, like, it's not cool for you to continue to approach me however you're approaching me, or whatever you're requesting of me. And my anger is the way I communicate that. But that's really sort of the superficial emotion. There's a deeper emotion behind that or underneath that, which may be, in the case that it could be anxiety, where it's like, well, I know that if I say that I'm stressed out, or that I worry that this could be embarrassing for me, that I could be ineffective at it, and therefore, instead of saying like, I don't feel prepared and this is stressing me out, producing anxiety, it's better that I say something defensive and maybe say it in an angry tone, and do something that deflects from the primary feeling that I'm really having.
That makes me wonder a little bit, like, how does a parent or an educator kind of be able to differentiate or decipher between what we regard as like a stereotypical moody teenage behavior and true anger that might be stemming from anxiety?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can divorce those two, because we're whole humans. So things are always happening in layers to us, right? There's always multiple factors that are contributing to our current emotional state. It's very rarely one thing, because we're not single organism people, right? Where there's so many things happening within us that and around us in our environment and our interaction with others, that it's really hard to isolate it. So moodiness is going to be a factor, right? Because part of adolescence is you're going through hormonal changes. So that is always going to be a factor. But in terms of parents' abilities to really tease that apart, I would say the best tip I would give is to start tracking the pattern So focus less on the one incident and start tracking a pattern of your child's behavior. Like, when does this tend to happen? Does it tend to happen like right before school?
Yeah.
When you're rushing out the door? Is the rushing provoking anxiety? Could you lengthen that a little bit so that there's less of a morning rush and less likely that you provoke the anxiety state right before starting school? Or is it happening one child hasn't eaten? If your student hasn't eaten, that could be it. So really thinking about what in the psychology world we refer to as antecedents, what happens before a behavior, and really tracking that pattern will give you a sense of like, okay, I see a theme over here. Every time I say X, you react in this way, and it tends to happen this time of the day when we're about to do this activity. Yeah. So really tracking that, and tuning into that with our youth, I think is really helpful at helping us tease apart. If you're a parent and you're trying to tease it apart, you got to start tracking, whether it's mentally or writing it down.
It is the attuneness. I think it's like, let's not overlook the power of the connection, right? When we're tuned into the needs of our kids and we can see their patterns. I remember a mom saying to me once that by the time her son got through the front door of school, he had already done something brave. Like she knew that him stepping in through the doors of school was already a huge accomplishment for him. And, that really stuck with me. It stuck with me that she was tuned in enough to be able to affirm how big that first step was.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage.
It really does.
And parents that recognize that this is courageous of their child to do things that are challenging.
For sure.
Right? I think that goes a long way in children feeling supported, and it goes a long way in mitigating the anxiety, because if someone has confidence in you, then you can feel a little bit more self-confidence. Sometimes if I'm feeling like I'm lacking courage and you say to me, girl, you got this, you can do it, then it's like, okay, maybe I can.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's such an important point too, right? Because I think it's like, and this is something that I will just vulnerably say, like, it's something that I'm working on too, is like tuning into my beliefs in the moment. So when you're working with families and students, Dr. Shinn, how often do you tap into the belief system of kids, right? Because again, we can think anxiety, the way that it presents itself as a protector, that they need to be protected in that moment, when really, if we tap into our belief system, we understand, like, there's nothing chasing me at this time. I am safe here. And so how often do you work with students in that belief zone?
Yeah, I mean, it's a large part of the work that has to be done when you're addressing anxiety, is really looking at, well, what are those internalized messages, and what's your self-talk, or the way you talk to yourself privately about things? How do you describe situations to yourself? And sometimes those can be accurate and helpful because it prepares us to confront challenges. If we can anticipate, oh, I see this doesn't look right, so let me avoid that circumstance. Let me go down this path instead. So it's adaptive to a certain point, but sometimes our self-talk can be very self-defeating, very self-critical. It can involve distortions of perception of what's happening. It can involve inaccurate mind reading of other people and what their intent is toward us. So as psychologists, when we work with students and when we work with families, we do address those belief systems, that self-talk, and how changing that can be a starting place for modifying how we feel in different circumstances.
So I'm thinking about the idea of tracking, right? Being able to identify the antecedent when we're trying to say, hey, there is a pattern of behavior here that might lead us to suspect that my child has anxiety. I'm also thinking about what the parents are going through, right? They're rushing to get their kid out the door. They're having this fight with their kid. They're on their way to work. Like, and that strategy of tracking is going to take a lot of cognitive energy to be able, for the parent to be able to track that, and also for the parent to be able to soothe themselves into like a state of, hey, listen, this behavior is happening because of X reason. Any tips or tricks for those parents to just be able to separate out between like the impact that the student, their child's behavior is having on them versus what they're seeing, and being able to be able to separate those things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a what we call a dyadic relationship between a parent and a child. And another more familiar word that people might know is it's symbiotic, in that there's a give and take, right? So what you're describing is that, what about the anxiety that the parent feels, right? It's stressful being a parent. It's like, I'm stressed out too. What about that, right? And how does that impact my kid? The fact that I'm also anxious. I got to get to work. I have an important meeting this morning. I've got a deadline. And at the same time, you're parenting. So it does still require a time of reflection. It doesn't have to be a big project of like, you got to sit down and do a task analysis, look at your history. You don't have to do that. You just have to take some time as a parent to, when you, as a parent, have those moments where you're reflecting. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so challenging. I'm so stressed out in the morning. I'm reflecting on how difficult it is to manage my child's anxiety in the morning. What can I be doing? In those moments where you're reflecting, just take some time to say, okay, well, what is happening that is leading up to that? And then saying, okay, is there anything I can tweak? Is anything I can attempt from an experimental standpoint to see if it will alleviate some of the pressure that provokes escalated anxiety? So the example that I shared with you earlier about rushing to school in the morning and getting ready to go out the door, if rushing is what you identify, like, okay, that's what sets off the fire of anxiety in the morning, then what can you do to rush a little less in the morning? Is it setting the alarm 5 to 7 minutes earlier? Would that 5 to 7 minutes make a difference? Is it that you have to do a little more preparing at night? And that looks very different for different families, right? So just small tips of that nature, really seeing what can you modify in the situation or the environment.
But there's always that balance, right? Especially when we're talking about teenagers in the stage of adolescence or, young adulthood, that they're going to be pushing back all the time and not necessarily saying, well, Mom, I don't need to set my alarm 7 minutes early. I got this. Tips and tricks there?
Yeah, you bring up another interesting point, that a tip can be applied, but when we're talking about teenagers and morning grumpiness, that's usually associated with lack of sleep. Because as a teenager, your judgment is not all there yet. It's developing, but you've not arrived at having good judgment, because you're still developing and you're going through huge growth spurts in all areas of development, right? So it's really hard to, under that physiological state and emotional state, to make good decisions. And so the bad decision a teenager will make is they'll stay up extra late. But that turns out not just to be a bad decision, it's really harmful for the morning, because then they're not getting adequate hours of sleep. And sleep is a big factor in that. So I think a lot of what happens with teenagers is that parents wait until they're in that high stress moment to really have that conversation about, honey, you wake up grumpy because you got 5 hours because you were up playing video games, right? That makes sense. That's why it's happening in that scenario. What can be done about it? When we're in a calm state, having that conversation with our teenager of like, hey, honey, what can we do? Because as a teenager, you need about 10 to 11 hours of sleep. They're like infants. And I know that sounds like a lot, but look it up. I mean, the CDC recommendations, I don't have them exactly memorized, but they're in that range for adolescents. It's like close to 10 hours, if not more, that they need, because they're in a high growth state, kind of like when you have infants. And so I think sort of really thinking about what are the things that affect a child's mood state in the morning, and oftentimes sleep is a big one.
Yeah. I mean that does remind me of, just as human beings, our hierarchy of needs. The first thing to tune into is the foundation. Have we slept? Have we eaten? Some of those things. Again, it's the attunement to be able to see the patterns in your child.
Yeah, and I would say too, if you have an infant, right, parents are really attuned to that, because they don't have the benefit of the child's language to communicate and say, Mom, Dad, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm that. So what do parents of very young children do? They're experts at tuning into the nonverbals. they're experts at it. They know if the child blinked a certain way, okay, that means they're hungry. If they coughed a particular, they tend to cough right before they've
Their
got to
cry.
poop.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
the
Their
cry,
cry
the
even.
pitch. They
Yeah.
can really pick it up. They're
Yeah.
really tuned into that. What happens over time as our children develop and grow is that as parents, we become more reliant on language, and we tune out of those initial skills that we had with our children. And what I'm saying is that, hey, if you have an adolescent, start looking at them in some ways the way you approached them when you were an infant. Tune in not to their language, their words, but start to tune in to all the other things that really are indicators that tell you the rest of their emotional state. And that's going to tell you how to help them. And if you practice that, you become skilled at it, just like a parent that knows my kid's soiled, they need a diaper change.
I love that. Can you give me some more examples of, for like educators and parents? Like, what are the nonverbal cues that we're kind of looking for, or patterns of behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, it varies from person to person, but like right now, Lynna, we're having this conversation. She's nodding her head. I tuned into like, she agreed with that. Like, she thought that that was a good question, right? And so that's a quick nonverbal of paying attention to, are your teenagers, are they nodding in agreement? Are they looking down? Are they fidgeting with items when you're having certain conversations? What's their behavior outside of that? Do they avoid certain tasks? Do they postpone it? That lets you know that's a tension point. Anything we avoid, there's a reason that there's a little bit of friction that we feel that causes us to avoid it because we're avoiding that friction. So there are lots of nonverbal signs that we can tune into, everything from body language that communicates affirmation to things like irritability. Irritability is probably the key way you can tell teenagers are a little off kilter about a particular topic, because they become irritable or grumpy. So those are other nonverbal signs. Anger, like we talked about, spending a lot of time doing other things, like social media, that can be sort of distractors as ways to avoid things that are stressful for them. So I think there's lots of small behaviors that you could tune into. Obviously not the ones that you have with an infant, but other more mature behaviors that are clues.
So speaking of tuning in and speaking of avoidance, this is definitely something that we're seeing more and more of at Fusion, right? Students who aren't just resistant to school, but who are like truly overwhelmed by it. So some of our families come in, and I think school avoidance can feel really sudden. But like you mentioned before, it's really something that has been building under the surface for a while. So can you help us understand that connection between anxiety and school avoidance?
Well, yeah, no one wants to do something that makes them anxious. An example that I can give you of like what that looks like is we all avoid things that stress us out. So for me, I'm a person that has 2 left feet. Like, I'm not a very well coordinated person, but I still need to walk about in the world, right? But I avoid things that I am going to suddenly be placed in a situation where I have to appear coordinated. So I'm not an athletic person. I don't do those types of things well. And so I tend to avoid it. So for me, I benefit from really practicing those things in advance.
So what I'm thinking about is, we've talked a little bit about signs to spot and how we can ask that question of what happened before. At what point do we seek out help from professionals like you?
Great question. I think that most anxiety can be well managed by the adults that are already in a child's life, as in their parents, their caregivers, their support system, educators at school, because a lot of anxiety is something that if you can kind of figure out what's provoking the anxiety, you're like, oh, okay, well, let's try it this way, and that something simple might alleviate it. I think you'll know that a student needs more support and needs to see a psychologist when it reaches a tipping point where it becomes debilitating. And what do I mean by that? It can mean something as extreme as straight out school avoidance, like student is not willing to leave their home. Parent attempts to get them to leave, the home to go to school, it turns into a huge tantrum. It's not a one-day event. It's a continual process. Child won't even get out of bed. So those really, that is a huge indicator that you have a major concern. The other is you don't have a child that has school avoidance. They have the courage to get there, but once they're there, they shut down. So signs of withdrawal, non-participation in activities, those are indicators like, okay, this anxiety is now impairing their ability to function at school because they won't speak up to answer a question. They won't speak to friends. They're having heightened anxiety or panic attacks on a school campus. Those are all indicators that you need help and that you should seek the support of a professional like myself.
I think we should, also talk about the impact of anxiety on learning, right? Because when we know in brain research that when anxiety is present, it literally shuts down our ability to access parts of our brain, parts like, that help us with memory and focus. So how does anxiety actually impact a student's ability to learn and then to show what they know in the classroom?
Right. It literally hijacks it. It takes over the brain, because there's such high levels of cortisol in the student in those moments. And cortisol is the stress hormone. So when there's high levels of cortisol, it impacts our thinking and our ability to tune in and absorb what is being taught to us. And so it's very, very detrimental to learning to have high levels of anxiety.
So even before we see the complete shutdown or school avoidance, or let's just say grades are tanking, things like that, what are some small interventions or early interventions that have probably the biggest impact, bang for your buck, when it comes to students with anxiety?
I would say some early interventions, starting with modeling courage, is important.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
Modeling courage, because the opposite of anxiety is calm, right? And so how do I feel calm? I feel calm when I know that I can courageously approach something and I can confidently do a good job. And so a small tip is giving students, the ability to anticipate what will happen, front loading them a little bit and saying, this is what you can anticipate. This is what tomorrow's going to look like. Tomorrow we're going to be working on this lesson. You can expect that this is what we're doing. Having a clear map of here's what my schedule is going to look like, having consistent routines. Those types of things go a long way to reducing the state of anxiety. But from a modeling courage standpoint from parents, I think parents often, we feel anxiety. I know that, and we can transmit that. As a parent myself, we can transmit that to our kids. And so modeling that courage, yeah, you're capable of doing this, and this is why. And when I feel anxious about something, this is how I approach it. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I tell parents about. Parents who are good managers of their stress and anxiety are just good at it. They just know that they're doing it, but they often don't do as good of a job at explaining how they do it and saying, well, when I encounter this is what I do.
It can be challenging to actually explain how to move through that.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of raising kids is to say, look, when I was your age and I went through this, I approached it that way. But sometimes kids will be like, okay, well, that was back in your day. But no, say something current. I'm dealing with this at work. That's making me anxious. This is how I am approaching it. This is how I'm working through it. Doesn't mean I have zero anxiety, but it means that I have some anxiety and I work to address that by doing these things. So those are ways that you model courage, by verbalizing how you approach anxiety-provoking things. And I think educators can do the same in the classroom. The educator doesn't have to be this angelic being that they're perfect, which we all know because we were all students. Within K through 12, where, your teacher, they're your idol. There's nothing that they can do wrong, especially if it's your favorite teacher. So in your mind, they don't have any of these anxious feelings, but for a teacher to self-disclose and say, hey, I feel anxious too. And when I feel anxious, this is how I approach it.
Yes, I think that vulnerability really leads to connection, which I want to get back to. One of the things that you mentioned, Martha, I want to share with you that I think you said that the opposite of anxiety is calm, and I love that. I've also thought about it as the opposite of anxiety is embodiment. And that has really, helped me. It's one of the things in my family system at home that my husband and I talk about a lot, because if we can tap into our source, right? If we can embody what's really internally within us, and if we can cultivate all of that in our kids, if we can cultivate that they have the ability to be creative and that they have that power within them that can show up, that embodiment, I think is really, it's something I guess that I wish we taught more of in school even. Yeah. So to go back to connection, one of the most protective factors I know for anxious students is connection. So having someone who, what I like to think of is like that really, really sees them. But for students that have this chronic anxiety, even relationships with anyone can feel very risky or even overwhelming. So what are some of the ways that we can support students in building healthy and trusting relationships, especially when anxiety makes that trust building really, really hard?
Yeah, I think it starts with educators. We can't task students to be the ones to initiate that process. We really have to task ourselves as the adults in the room to be initiating that process, to make an attempt to befriend our students. Of course, in an appropriate way that is consistent with their developmental stage, and recognizing the differences in our role and our relationship. But within that, I think that there's a lot that educators can do to approach students, not just in a welcoming way, but really endeavor to befriend them. Because if you find ways to befriend students and get to know them and find out about their interests and their likes and their dislikes, they begin to open up. And I think that what I've seen in my career is that teachers that really take the time to do that, to get to know their students, those students disclose things to them. They know things about their student that other teachers don't. And so I think that is always a good starting place so that we can get really at the core of what distresses the student, and then how can I support them once I know that.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeking to understand is so powerful.
What do you think that kids with school anxiety wish that the adults around them understood?
I mean, I'll say it like a kid would or a teenager. I can't help it. I don't know why I feel anxious, right? And sometimes teenagers will verbalize it, but the truth is that they often don't know. And if I had to articulate what might be hard for an adolescent to articulate, I would say that teenagers want parents to know that, like, yeah, sometimes I feel stressed or anxious and I don't know what to do about it. And it'd be helpful to me if you could help me figure out how to handle different situations, that you could be tuned into what's causing it for me. Because oftentimes they don't know. They just know that they feel it. And I also think it's important for parents and other adults in the child's life to recognize that I can't help it. Sometimes I don't know what provokes my anxiety and I don't know why I feel anxious in this moment. It suddenly happens to me. And that they're not able to sort of name it in order to prevent it or take the steps to prevent it. So, and the other thing I would add is, Mom, Dad, I'm not trying to stress you out with my anxiety. I'm not doing it on purpose. I'm sorry for being grumpy. The grumpiness is really just a way that I'm dealing with my anxiety, or I'm sorry that I'm shutting down or not sharing, because all those are clues that I might really feel anxious. But a teenager can't say that because that might be outside of their conscious awareness. They may not yet have had a self-assessment to be aware enough of their emotional state to express that to their parent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's taken me 42 years to get to the point where I can actually label, okay, I am feeling a little stressed and anxious at this point.
Yeah.
Let me discover why.
Or I'm also thinking about teenagers being in a place in which they might think that, you know what, I'm a young adult at this point. I should be able to handle this myself. And the shame of not being able to, and not necessarily having the skills yet or the courage to be able to ask for help when they need it, also plays into that.
Part of being a teenager is you're trying out stuff for the first time, and you don't know what you don't know and what you're not going to be good at until you try it. So on the one hand, we want to encourage that discovery and risk-taking in our youth. But on the other hand, we want them to have the right tools to be as successful as they can at it. And I think as a parent, the best you can do is making resources available, making those additional ideas or strategies available to your youth so that they know, like, hey, you may have not thought of all these things, but I've done something similar. So I found that trying these things helps, or preparing in this way helps. So just sharing with you that this is available. You're welcome to try it this way first, but this is also available. And giving them an opportunity to save face. Because if, for example, you say to me, Mike, like, okay, well, I think you should try this, and I plow ahead and I don't do it, now I kind of feel a little bit, I don't want to go back and be like, yeah, man, Mike, you were right. Like, I messed up. Maybe right now I'd be mature enough to admit that, but as a teenager, I wouldn't be mature enough to admit that. So giving our kids the opportunity to make mistakes and feel comfortable making those mistakes and taking those risks, even if it's anxiety provoking, allowing them to fail within a certain safety net, I think is really important to building their confidence and decreasing that anxiety.
Yeah. Permission, right? Permission.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does anxiety actually impact a student's ability to learn and show what they know?
Yeah, well, anxiety literally hijacks the brain. And so I'll give you an example that's separate from learning. If you and I are in an anxious state and I say to you, okay, Lynna, go get your keys. We gotta hurry up and get to the meeting. And we're both stressed. We're running late. How easy or hard is it for you to find your keys?
Super hard to find my keys.
Right. Because anxiety has taken over. We're stressed. We're running late. We know this isn't a high stakes meeting that we have to get to. And suddenly something that if we were in a calm state, we would say, okay, let me think through, where was the last time I had my keys? Where do I usually put them? And we can think calmly and trace our steps back and recognize, like, all right, I think, let me check these 4 places where I think I might have left my keys based on my recollection. And we can do that in a calm state, but it's exceedingly difficult when we're stressed out. That's what happens in the brain when we're anxious. Now apply that to learning. Now, if you're in a learning situation and you have to learn something new and your brain is scrambling in the same way that it is when you're frantically looking for your keys, try learning under those conditions. That's what's happening when anxiety hacks your brain at school. Mike, to that question about like a tip that I would give parents, I would say one of the things is, don't relate to your kids' anxiety by talking about what you did in school 20 years ago. It doesn't apply. A more meaningful example is to talk about anxiety that you're dealing with today, your job demands, because that more closely mirrors what they're going through at school. At your job, you're dealing with technology and having to submit things or to send off emails or to complete projects, right? Regardless of the parent's line of work. Even if the parent's line of work is running their own business or running their household. I mean, all of that requires organizing your day. It comes with specific demands and specific stressors and requires very specific skills to manage those stressors. Those actually parallel the modern experience that your student is having. And those are better discussions to have versus talking about, well, when I was in high school, I did this. When you were in high school looked totally different. And so you really want to be giving them examples about your current stressors. And I think work, because that is our school, that's sort of our system that we go to, whether we go to a 9 to 5 job or where we work independently, our work is our education, where we continuously learn. And so that's a better parallel. The other thing that does is it gives your child a preview of what to expect in adulthood that begins to prepare them for what it looks like, instead of building up fear about, I don't know what adulthood looks like because my parents just act like adults. They don't describe to me what their day looks like.
So, Dr. Shinn, I know there is a wide spectrum of feelings that come alongside anxiety. Can you tell us a little bit more about how anxiety actually feels in the body for our students?
Right. That's a great question, because anxiety is a spectrum, right? We talk about the spectrum readily when we're talking about autism, and people sort of now have a concept socially of like, oh, we talk about the autism spectrum. People are beginning to understand socially what that means. But when we talk about anxiety, people are not necessarily speaking of it in a spectrum, but it is a spectrum, everything from mild anxiety to very debilitating anxiety. So as anxiety rises, it can peak in a panic attack, and that can come with physiological symptoms, everything from tightness in your chest to difficult breathing, having very shallow breathing, contracting your muscles, feeling flush, having temperature changes, like feeling super hot or super cold, having tics in our body. So there are lots of symptoms that can indicate that we're ramping up anxiety, and anxiety at its peak is a panic attack, right? And that panic attack can be very overt, or it can be very slight, where the person, it's hard to pick up, but they're having panic symptoms. So those are some of the physiological symptoms. The other thing that's part of that spectrum is that we have things that are called like psychologically induced anxiety, or what we call like somatic symptoms. So soma is the Latin word for body, and it means that when we have psychosomatic symptoms, it's something that starts off maybe in our feeling state, in our thinking, and then gets converted into a physiological symptom. So for some kids, this will look like, oh, my belly hurts. So that is a very common somatic symptom. Students reporting like, oh my goodness, my stomach hurts. And you're like, okay, your stomach's always hurting. You take them to the doctor, and the doctor's like, yeah, they don't have IBS. They're not having any stomach issues. The gastroenterologist checked them out. Everything's great. But you keep having complaints of belly aches. That's a somatic symptom, because it lets us know that those anxious feelings translate to feeling it in your belly. For other people, it's like when they have heightened anxiety, they feel it in their shoulders, they feel it in their back, they'll complain of headaches. So those are all physiological symptoms that are clues to the experience of anxiety that we feel. Other indicators of anxiety outside of panic that are on that spectrum is tantrums. So typically when we think of tantrums, people think of the terrible twos, and 3-year-old tantrums. So that's what we think about it. But you can have a teenage tantrum too, right? You can have an adult one as well. But a teenage tantrum might look like talking back, yelling,
Right.
and those too are indicators of heightened anxiety that you want to pay attention to. And they are physical manifestations of the anxiety. So everything from things that occur in our body, somatic symptoms that stem from anxiety, to other things that can peak as indicators of anxiety, like panic attacks or teenage tantrums.
The social dynamic, that could be really complex in terms of how that feeds a student's anxiety.
Yeah.
And that could be social dynamics that could be as severe as actual bullying going on. or navigating relationships with their peers when they feel out of touch.
Right. That's an excellent point. I mean, social anxiety can stem from lots of places, and you touched on a few right there in your comment, which is, feeling ineffective at social situations. So if I'm a person on the autism spectrum, it's really hard for me to read others. And so approaching a social context is very anxiety provoking because I may not know, well, what's the social expectation in here? If something is outside of the social expectations I'm familiar with already, then I might feel very stressed about the unknown, about what would be required of me, what will others ask of me in that moment socially. Will I need to perform in a way that I feel ill-equipped to perform? So being a person that's on the autism spectrum, that provokes a lot of social anxiety, especially as you mature and have more awareness of, I know that I am supposed to be doing something, but I don't know necessarily what that thing is, or I have a sense of it, but I really don't know how to do it fluidly, or I feel uncomfortable about having to do it. For persons on the autism spectrum, that has to do with sensory sensitivities. If something requires you to be in a social environment with lots of noise and you're sensitive to sound, that instantly becomes anxiety provoking. If something requires you to be in physical contact with others because it's a PE class, let's say, or you're doing something where people are touchy-feely and they're hugs because it's a social club of some sort, then that can be very anxiety provoking because it feels really uncomfortable on my skin to approach people physically in that way, especially unfamiliar people. So that's one example. The other can be, as you mentioned, that some students have experienced teasing or bullying. They'll avoid things that will expose them, place them at risk of ridicule by their peers if their peers have historically teased or bullied them. And then the other one that you mentioned there was performance anxiety. And performance anxiety comes from a place of, if I don't perform in a way that others will praise, they will criticize me and I will be humiliated. And so the fear of that, the fear of humiliation, of feeling ineffectual in front of others looking at me and going, ha, 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 anticipating that. And that can provoke a great degree of social anxiety. There's other things that can create social anxiety, like agoraphobia, being connected to it, fear of enclosed or open spaces, that can also produce that as well.
All right, now it is time to separate fact from fiction. It's time for some myth busting. Dr. Shinn, are you ready for myth number one?
I'm ready.
All right. A child's anxiety comes from their parents' anxiety.
Wrong answer. No, it doesn't come from their parents' anxiety. Anxiety is something that is individual to the person. Now, as parents or other people in the child's life, we play a role in supporting them. We play a role even in what we call co-regulation. So co-regulation is the idea that I lend you my calm, that I lend you my nervous system state and I show you what that looks like. And so I can support you in regaining calm.
All right, myth number two. Anxiety is just an excuse to avoid work and responsibility.
No, that's not true. Faulty reasoning. It is not an excuse. It's an indicator that I feel anxious. Therefore, I'm avoiding things that provoke my anxiety or worsen it. So it actually is the opposite. Whenever we notice that our student is avoiding things, that should be a red flag to us as parents, as educators, to say, wait, why is my student wanting to avoid this? Is it the task itself that's inherently challenging? Is it the skills that I'm asking them to use that maybe they are not fully developed in and I can help them with those skills? But it's not that they're avoiding it for avoidance sake. Avoidance is the effect, not the cause.
All right, myth number three. Anxiety always looks like worry from the outside.
That's probably the biggest myth that we need to bust, because most people think that anxiety is something that is observable. And there are some forms of anxiety that we can see. Like if a person's wringing their hands or they're sweating bullets under a stressful situation and it's not 90 degrees outside, we might be like, that person looks anxious, or they're obviously hyperventilating, right? Those are overt signs of anxiety. But a large majority of anxiety and symptoms are internalizing, and those are not visible to observers. They're suffered by the individual, they're experienced by the individual, and it really takes paying attention to those more nuanced things in the person's presentation and how they act, what they say and do, that's what's going to let us know whether or not they're experiencing anxiety. And it does not always look like worry. It can look like lots of other things, like shutting down, like withdrawal, like being shy.
So what really stands out from today's conversation is just how powerful it is when we really slow down and we listen to what anxiety is trying to tell us, right? So I think behind every moment of school refusal and the sense of overwhelm is a student who just in their heart wants to feel safe and seen and supported. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Dr. Shinn, for guiding us towards a greater understanding and greater compassion. Thank you for being here.
Of course, happy to be here. It's a great conversation.
Every child learns differently, and understanding how your child learns can change everything from their school success to everyday confidence. That's why Fusion Academy created a short quiz to help you better understand your students' learning DNA. In just a few minutes, you'll get personalized insights into your students' unique learning preferences, plus tips to better support them at home and in the classroom. Take the quiz today. It's quick, it's free, and it may just unlock your students' full potential. Visit fusionacademy.com/podcast. That's fusionacademy.com/podcast.
We know learning differently requires showing up differently. So here are some tools, insights, and strategies to help. It's time for real talk, real tools. The Child Mind Institute comes up for me this week because they have some of the most accessible evidence-based resources out there. Their tools are especially helpful because they're written for both parents and for educators. If your child is avoiding school or melting down before the day even begins, it may not be defiance. It could be anxiety. One of the most important things to understand is that avoidance feeds anxiety. While it's natural to want to protect your child from distress, keeping them home or removing the trigger teaches their brain that school really is unsafe, and over time that makes it even harder to return. Instead of eliminating the stressor, help your child face it gradually and with support. Break down the morning routine, preview what's ahead, celebrate small wins like walking into the building or attending just one class. A great resource for families navigating this is the Child Mind Institute. They offer practical, compassionate tools for managing school refusal and anxiety in kids. Try this. When your child resists going to school, take a breath and say, I know this is hard. I believe in you. Let's face this together. You're not just helping them show up to school. You're helping them build courage for life.
Lee, I think all those resources that you're pointing at, it's just such a good reminder that it's all about the relationships and connections that we're making with our kids, right? I'm thinking about my own kid, Logan. She's 12. She's going to basically be a teenager to the point where she doesn't want to talk to me anymore, right? And so Dr. Shinn's reminders about not only just relying on what she's telling me, because she doesn't tell me jack squat anymore. What are the other signs that I have to read to make sure that I'm in tune with her?
Yeah, I think the attunement really resonated with me too, right? Because she was talking about these nonverbal cues, and I think she gave such a great example of when they were infants, right? When our kids were babies, and we were tuned into every cry and every little smirk, like everything.
You were, I wasn't.
Okay. All right. Well, I was. I know my husband was too, but I think what she said was that sort of changes over time. But what a great tip for parents to recognize is tune back in to some of those nonverbals instead of making assumptions. Tune back into the nonverbals that will leave you with a chance to create a very, I think, profound connection again with your child.
Yeah. And I love when she was talking about antecedents and like that practice of asking why did this happen?
Yes.
Right? Like it can feel pedantic, it can feel exhausting, but like how do we get these at the root causes of why our kids feel like this?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, gosh, I have a 4-year-old and she asks the best questions right now. I mean, it is literally why this, why that. And I can sense myself getting a little bit frustrated sometimes, but I start to become self-aware because again, it's like revisiting that attunement of like asking those why questions is what allows for the deeper connection to happen. One of the things that came up for me, Mike, when Dr. Shinn was talking was when I was in high school, I definitely experienced anxiety. I don't remember it being necessarily consistent for every single year, but let's call it I guess, Sunday night spiral.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that you had anxiety in high school? Girl, you had anxiety on the ride in to do the podcast.
That's true. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
It
is. I think I'm high functioning, is what I'm realizing. But this Sunday night spiral, okay, it happens to me now sometimes too, which is, Saturday night, I'm chilling. I'm good.
Yeah.
I feel comfortable. I'm safe. And in high school, Sunday night came around and a little bit of panic started to set in.
Scary.
Sunday night, though, I remember headaches, Mike. Like Dr. Shinn mentioned some of these manifestations of stress and anxiety. I remember headaches and I remember, getting sort of like tightness in my stomach.
Yeah.
And some of like those more somatic feelings that she explained to us is what is going on in our body. And then, by the time Monday hit, I was at times just full on. I was stressed. And so I think it's the reminder that this is rooted in, fear a lot of the times. And again, to recognize not what's at the surface, like this wasn't about how I dislike science class. This was like the root of it was an actual fear that somehow was existing within me.
So what'd you do about it?
I don't know that I had really great coping mechanisms in
So what'd you do? Just do better? Were you a straight A kid?
I was not a straight A kid. My family stressed achievement. But I mean, I was really active in sports. And so I'd be, I'm Tiny Tim, I'm 5'2", but I was playing basketball, AAU basketball.
Wait. I think people also need to know, to the people listening or watching, we have a record holder here.
3-point record of my high school. It's my claim to fame. But what I was saying is that I think I did other things to avoid the way that I was feeling. I think I got really into, sports and again, the things that were distracting me, which it's what our kids do today. These are the kids that we serve.
I think it's good to shake things up, right? And, we had mentioned earlier, talking about the anxious generation, and there's less kids outside playing with unstructured playtime, right?
Gosh, that book blew my mind.
And
yes.
Oftentimes we isolate our kids and they're just drawn towards their phones. We need to get them out, get them active, get them social with people in person. We need them to have the social interactions in person so that they can practice some of these things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that book it's so phenomenal, right? Because it really talks to readers and audiences about how childhood has changed, right? Where it was so much of a play-based childhood has now been replaced with all of these other things. And so again, getting back to connection, getting back,
it's all about relationships.
It's all about the relationships, Mike. It's all about relationships.
Fusion changed everything for me because it finally made me feel like I can learn just the way I am.
And she's really looked forward to coming here, and it changed her whole outlook.
First class I had was my math class, which was my most daunting subject. But I walked in there, I didn't see any math anywhere. I saw a teacher, and he had me sit down, and he said, "How are you doing?" And I sat there for a minute like, what? Like, and I just realized after a while, no, he's a normal person, and this is just normal people having a conversation. The one-on-one immediately felt so safe for me.
Fusion changed everything for Maddie because she didn't have the anxiety about doing school. And she actually said this to me verbatim: for the first time in my life, I'm actually learning. And she was excited, and she felt engaged, and the curriculum was centered around her interests, which was amazing.
I really picked up my passion for music again. Music is what I want to pursue, and Fusion makes me feel like that is a real possibility.
When we came to Fusion, we were just looking for Maddie to reduce her anxiety, but what we found was her passion for learning and so much more. And she actually made friends and got along great with teachers, and was excited to go to school.
Since coming into Fusion, I've grown a tremendous amount. Like it's like 2 different lifetimes. Like, I was a different person before coming in, and I'm a different person now.
For any parents going through something like this, I would say trust your intuition, because if I could go back, I would have made the decision to do Fusion right away, because it changed things dramatically for her and for all of us.
And now, my favorite part of the show, where the numbers, the neuroscience, and the public policy intersect. It's time for the research roundup. This one really got me. Among students with anxiety, 75% report school as their number one stressor. And that's according to the Pew Research Center. That one really kills me. As educators, we want to build a kid's confidence. And to think that we're the leading source of stress and anxiety for them, it's heartbreaking. But it doesn't have to be that way. And the other piece of research that stood out to me from the National Institute of Mental Health is that a full 32% of adolescents aged 13 to 18 experience an anxiety disorder. Jonathan Haidt talks about the anxious generation, and we are unfortunately living in the midst of it. But with our conversation with Dr. Shinn today, I sure feel a whole lot of hope. I mean, I think about what we do at Fusion. Our kids are looking forward to coming to school for the first time in a long time, because they know that that team of teachers around them is going to be able to support them. They know that that student body there, they're going to support them, and that they know that there's always going to be somebody to help them through the tough times, and that they, Yeah.
You talk a lot about the ecosystem of care.
I love the ecosystem of
You
care.
love the ecosystem of care, and I think it's so wise, right? It's so wise because it is not just one or two things. It's truly an ecosystem that pours into our students to make them feel safe and seen and heard.
Yeah, and for those, I mean, what the ecosystem of care is, it's not just the teachers and the kids and the administrators in the school. It's about how we involve professionals like Dr. Shinn into that web to support kids, right? What role do the parents play? What are the additional supports that we have on campus that are wrapped around this kid to just make sure that they're getting what they need?
Yeah. I mean, when they're little, we say it takes a village, right? Why do we lose that? We lose that somehow. I mean, as it takes a village. It takes a village.
It takes a village, and I will say that I remember one researcher said that one of the most detrimental things that happened to our society was the advent of the nuclear family.
Oh
right?
my gosh. Yes, my husband and I talk about this all the time.
Right? Because it used to be you got in trouble, or maybe you weren't having such a great day. That neighbor down the street would spot it. Or maybe you had an auntie living down the block as well.
No, I mean, I don't think even family systems are not meant to exist in that way, right? We're not meant to exist singularly. Even as human beings, we thrive in connection. Like it's a need that we have. Connection is a human need.
Unfortunately, some of our kids are connecting with connection and relationships is the number of friends that they have on social media, right? And oftentimes those kids with thousands of followers are sometimes the ones that feel the most isolated.
Right. Yeah, that's such a good point. I want to just mention one other stat that you said that really stood out to me, which was 1 in 3 adolescents are living with anxiety disorder. And those that name school as their top stressor, I just think about how they're quietly suffering. You know, we say 1 in 3, and those are the ones that we've identified. There's so many other students who we haven't identified that are struggling with anxiety. And, you know, I would just say, I just don't think that the traditional school environment was designed with them in mind.
No, it was designed to get as many kids through as quick as possible. Well, maybe not as quick.
Thanks so much for joining us on Learning Differently. We are grateful that you're here doing the work, asking the questions, and showing up for the students who need it most. Supporting learners who think and experience the world differently takes curiosity and care and corazón, heart. Because when we understand how they learn,
We unlock who they can become.
we'll see you next time.